Hi, I'm Dale Wells. Thank you for joining me in this study of the mission of the church. This is the 6th of 11 lessons from 2 Corinthians that I'm calling the mission. In our earlier lessons, we've seen that as far as Paul is concerned, every Christian is a representative of Christ. Our actions either draw people to the Lord or drive them away. We are the aroma of Christ, spreading His fragrance to the world around us. We are the image of Christ to others. If they're going to see Jesus, they need to see Him in us. In this lesson, we resume our focus on the mission of the church as Paul laid it out. One thing we all need to know is that every one of us is a minister. Our ministry is described by Paul, in part, with these words. 2 Corinthians 5:20. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors. As though God were making His appeal through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. We need to remember, every Christian is a representative for Christ. To use Paul's word, we collectively, and you and I individually, are Christ's ambassadors. We're all charged to explain our faith to anyone at any time. Peter said, "In your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." There's no hour of the day or night that we're in contact with people that we're not teaching them something, either by word or example, either publicly or privately. Paul addresses all of us who would communicate Christ to others. He's given us a glimpse of what we are. As ministers of a new covenant, we are the fragrance of Christ as we are being transformed into the image of Christ, whom we represent to the world. In our last lesson, we saw that our ministry does not originate with us, but with God. Today we turn to the fact that this treasure we have is contained in clay jars. Clay jars were the throwaway containers of the ancient world, so that their lifespans were generally a few years at the most. They were used to store and transport water and olive oil and wine and grain, and even family treasures. Earthenware jars were an anonymous part of everyday living. They were used for cooking and eating and drinking and storing leftovers. Every domestic archaeological excavation site contains their remains. They're called ostraca, from the Greek word for pottery. No one took note of clay jars any more than we would take note of a styrofoam fast food container. They were simply there for convenience. It was no great tragedy when they were broken. They were cheap and easy to replace. And that's what Paul uses as a penetrating metaphor for our humanity. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Remember that Adam was formed out of the dust of the ground, and when he died, he returned to dust. Like clay jars, we are all frail, weak, transitory mortals. But sometimes valuable things can be hidden in ordinary containers. For example, the greatest manuscript discovery in history occurred less than 75 years ago between November 1946 and February 1947. A Bedouin shepherd was throwing rocks into caves in the rocky hills on the western shore of the Dead Sea. He heard the sound of breaking pottery, and he went into the cave to investigate. Inside, he discovered 7 scrolls in clay jars in a cave near what is now known as the Qumran site on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Incidentally, archaeologists have believed for years that Qumran was an Essene community dedicated to copying manuscripts. However, it's strange that they never found a single inkwell, they never found any writing materials, they never found any place that was conducive to copying scrolls. Museums still work on that theory today primarily because they found all of these scrolls nearby. What they did find was a lot of pottery, and so current thinking is considering the possibility that this Qumran community was in the business of manufacturing clay pots. So why were the scrolls near there, and why were all the scrolls different and not multiple copies of the same texts? Well, it's possible that the temple library was moved into the caves during the Jewish-Roman War in 68 to 72 AD, while the Zealots were on their way to defend Masada. This was the discovery of the first of almost 1,000 scrolls in the cave near Qumran. This was the way some of the scrolls looked when they were found over the next several years. Here's the way they looked after they were carefully unrolled by archaeologists. So when we understand just how unimportant the container is when it's compared with the treasure it contains, Paul's famous declaration pulses with meaning. But we have this treasure in jars of clay. What treasure? Paul described it in verse 6 as the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Jesus Christ. The treasure is God's illuminating power that He exhibited first in creation and then in redemption. This treasure, this transforming gospel power, has been committed to insignificant, fragile followers of Christ, men and women, you and me, all of us who, like Paul, are just clay pots. The reason for this is so there would be no mistake about where the power comes from. Paul says, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. This is not a pious pro forma acknowledgement that we are weak and God is strong. It's not a casual admission. It's Christian realism. Christians are never powerful in ourselves. We are only vessels in which God's power is exhibited. Our utter frailty and weakness provides the ground for God's power. In 2 Corinthians 12, verses 8 and 9, near the end of this letter, Paul rejoices that his weakness makes him a conduit for God's power. He talks about a thorn in the flesh, and he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And in chapter 4, the breaking up of our clay vessels through the crushing circumstances of life allows the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, verse 6, to shine forth in full creational gospel power. In all of this, then, Paul is graphically and categorically stating that our weakness is essential to and necessary for the display of His power. It's easy to misread what Paul says here, so that we interpret it as the means of enhancing our power. So we might imagine that as we embrace our weakness, God pours His power into us so that we become powerful. The natural equation is my weakness plus God's power equals my power. But that's not what Paul is saying. Rather, he teaches us that as we embrace our weakness, God fills us with His power so that His power is revealed through us. We don't become powerful. We remain weak. We do not grow in power. We grow in weakness. We go from weakness to weakness, which is to remain vessels of His power, always weak and always strong. Someone once asked Francis of Assisi how he was able to accomplish so much in his life. He replied, "This may be why. The Lord looked down from heaven and said, 'Where can I find the weakest, littlest man on earth?' Then He saw me and said, 'I found him,' and He won't be proud of it. He'll see that I am only using him because of his insignificance." That's very much like what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 4:7. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. Have we embraced our weakness as a way of life and as the invitation to God's surpassing power? There are some paradoxes involved in this power that Paul gets into in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 8 and 9. He gives 4 parallel paradoxes that all illustrate Paul's experience of the clay pot axiom in his own life, namely that weakness invites strength. The paradoxes are autobiographical of Paul's constant experience. At the same time, they touch on the biography of every committed Christian disciple. They also provide a panorama of Christian history through the centuries and even describe some people we've known. This is one of the grand rhetorical moments in Paul's writings. Each paradox is called a lapidary, a concise statement that's suitable for engraving. It's polished and balanced, and it follows the same pattern and hinges on the identical emphatic adversative, but not. And the paradoxes together present an ascending intensity of weakness countered with power. Take a look at them. Paul begins, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed." What he's saying is that the earthen vessel of his life was hard-pressed in the radical sense of being pressured. The Greek word thalibo that he uses for pressure means to crush or compress or oppress or trouble. It's probably best represented by our word squeezed. Any number of the catastrophes that befell Paul could have exerted intense compressions, but his pressured weakness was ever met with God's power so that he was not crushed. The great New Testament scholar Merrill Tenney wrote a translation of this that he never actually published, but I think brilliantly expresses it. He says, "We are squeezed but not squashed." Perfect. Paul, clay vessel that he was astonishingly resilient but never squashed. Second, he was perplexed but not in despair. In Greek, these words form a kind of a rhyming wordplay. Aporumenoi, but not exaporumenoi, as the second word intensifies the first. There have been a lot of attempts to try to capture that wordplay in English. At a loss, but not at a loss, or in despondency, yet not in despair, or confused, but not confounded. But I think Dr. Tenney gets it best. He puts it this way: bewildered, but not befuddled. Fragile as Paul's humanity was when it was confronted with difficulties and loss, he was never befuddled and never despairing. It was said of Napoleon that he had an unquestioned magic for victory, but no technique for defeat. The great general riding his beautiful mount at Austerlitz became the despairing horseman slouching in retreat from Moscow. But Paul had a technique for defeat and weakness in the all-surpassing power that belongs to God. Was he perplexed at times? Yes, but not driven to despair. Was he bewildered at times? Yes, but not befuddled. Third, Paul says he was persecuted but not abandoned. Paul knew what it was like to be persecuted. The Greek word dioko, to pursue or persecute, with the idea of hunting people down. And yet he says he was never forsaken by God. Now, the Old Testament background of this word was of an army fleeing from another army and being hounded by that pursuing force. Paul would have known what this was like from the giving end, because if you remember, when he was still a Jew before his conversion experience, he was hounding Christians just as he was now being hounded. But God cannot forsake his chosen vessels. When Jesus prophetically cried from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" quoting Psalm 22, verse 1, he knew, as Peter said on Pentecost, that he would not be abandoned to the grave. And more, God will not forsake any of his people, for we are redeemed by his Son. Paul was absolutely confident of God's abiding presence, regardless of how or where he was hounded. The fourth paradox peaks the final expression: struck down but not destroyed. Struck down is the Greek word katabalo. It means to throw down. and it could refer to being struck down by a weapon, whacked, as we might say. But Paul was not destroyed. Rather, he was quickly back on his feet. We know of one of these events in Lystra when Paul was hunted down and ritually stoned, which was itself a ghastly, cruel event, that was capped by his body being dragged outside of the city to rot. But to the astonishment of his disciples, Paul popped open an eye and led them right back into the city of Lystra in Acts chapter 14. Again, Merrill Tenney's rendering catches the idea. Knocked down, but not knocked out. Incredible strength in the midst of total weakness. You can catch the intensity of Paul's paradoxes by stacking the sufferings he endured in the earthen vessel of his body, using Tenney's rendering. Squeezed, bewildered, pursued, knocked down. What an abject weakness. But we have God's surpassing power in the other part of each of those statements. But not squashed, not befuddled, not abandoned, not knocked out. What astonishing power. Again, Paul says, 2 Corinthians 4:7, we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. It wasn't that Paul, in each case, reached down into his soul, sucked it up, and became the man. It was never his strength. It was always God's strength. Paul's weakness was the occasion for God's power. Paul remained a clay pot, and a cracked pot at that, as his crumbling flesh allowed the power of God to shine so brightly. As Paul deepens his point, he goes on to talk to the Corinthians about how his experience of power through weakness was in effect like that of Jesus in his death. Jesus' death was his weakness, his resurrection was his power. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 10 and 11. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. That's the way he sums up his paradoxical experiences with a radically Christ-focused statement. The death of Jesus is seen in us so that the life of Jesus can also be revealed in us. He talks about death. To understand this, we have to note very carefully that the word that he uses for death here is not the normal word for death. He uses the word necrosis, not the word thanatos. And the word necrosis refers to the process of dying rather than to the final state of death. So C.K. Barrett explains that Paul's meaning is that one who observed his life as a Christian apostle would see constantly repeated a process analogous to the killing of Jesus. Paul carried about in his body the dying of Jesus as he lived out his calling as Christ's ambassador. He concluded his letter to the Galatians by saying, "From now on let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus." Galatians 6:17. Paul got those marks in 4 kinds of suffering when he was squeezed and bewildered and pursued and knocked down. They were the same thing Jesus experienced as he died. Indeed, Jesus, by virtue of his solidarity with Paul, knew those sufferings. Jesus could have said to Paul's persecutors, "Why are you persecuting me?" just as he had once said it to Paul on the Damascus road. Then he talks about life. Though bearing in his body the killing of Jesus, that was a part of Paul's experience of ministering the new covenant, it was not in an end itself. We who serve Jesus share in his dying so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. This refers both to the here and now and to the life hereafter. Those who observed Paul saw the life of Jesus in the amazing power that was displayed through Paul's weakness, as he was not squashed and not befuddled and not abandoned and not knocked out. In the same way, the life of Jesus is manifested in the lives of those who truly follow him. And ultimately, these realities will be full-blown in our final deliverance from mortality in the great resurrection of the dead. To emphasize these great truths, Paul repeats himself again in stronger terms in verse 11. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. That's interesting. That statement, we are given over to death. It's the same language that was used by Mark in Mark 9:31 and Mark 10:33 to describe Jesus being handed over to his enemies. The sufferings of those who follow Christ are not haphazard. They are part of the divine plan for the spread of the gospel. It remains God's will that his frail jars of clay, you and me, be used to show that the surpassing power belongs to God. Paul concludes this astonishing paragraph with an unexpected twist, because by the way Paul has been structuring his thought, we would expect him to say something like, so death is at work in us, but life is also at work in us. But that's not what he says. What he says is, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. This, of course, is the great principle of the cross. Christ died that we might live. The great exchange of the gospel is Christ's life for ours. And those who are used most to spread the good news of Christ embrace death as the operational principle of ministry. In the 1800s, English orphans were housed in disease-infested institutions, forced to work long hours, barely fed, and harshly treated. Charles Dickens described the conditions in his book, Oliver Twist. George Mueller gave up everything he owned and worked without salary for the sake of those orphans. Without asking for money, he prayed 3 orphanages into existence. But his heart broke for those he still had to turn away. His next prayer request was for something impossible, an orphanage for 700. Times were hard, and people thought he was crazy. But Mueller journaled these words, "The greatness of the sum required affords me a kind of secret joy. For the greater the difficulty to be overcome, the more will it be seen to the glory of God how much can be done by prayer and faith." Before his death, Mueller clothed, sheltered, and educated over 10,000 orphans without ever asking for a penny. When he was asked how he did it, he bowed his head and replied, "There was a day when I died to George Mueller." Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me." Praise God for the powerful resiliency this brings, so that we are squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not befuddled, pursued but not abandoned, knocked down but not knocked out. How beautiful that this reflects the life of Jesus in us, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our bodies. How heartening to know that when you live this way, death is at work in us, but life is at work in those whom God has called us to serve. What a glory that the power of New Covenant ministry comes by embracing weakness. What a word for the church today, with our human idolatries and our exalting of human beings. The power of the gospel comes in our weakness, not in our strength. Not in our greatness, but in the fact that we are like clay pots, and cracked ones at that. Who are you? You're just a clay pot. But God has put His treasure inside of you, and He expects you to share His treasure with others. Don't ever expect or hope for them to say, "My, what a beautiful clay pot." Expect them rather to say, "My, what a marvelously great God." You are Christ's ambassador. to show the riches of God's grace that He has shown to you in Jesus Christ, so that He may show the same grace to others. When you end this lesson today, ask yourself, to whom can I show this treasure? Then do it.